Welcome to the Magellan Podcast, navigating education in the 21st century. This podcast brings the expertise of Magellan Learning Solutions to the biggest questions and issues in higher education. It is produced and directed by Adam Reich, podcast theme written and recorded by Wayne Patton, and features Magellan partners Wayne Patton, Aaron Traphagen, and Emily Eddy. If you listen to discussions about higher education, you'll find a plethora of ways that people talk about it. Is it a workforce development machine? Is it a training ground for future leaders? Is it a place where people grow into fully-fledged human beings? The answer is yes. It's all these, and the language we use to talk about higher education affects how we do it. Join us for a conversation about the many ways we talk about higher education.
All right, well, welcome to the Magellan Podcast. We've been away for a while, but we're back. I guess this is season 2, I'm told. That's why we took the break. As always, I am Aaron Traphagen, and I'm joined by my business partners, Doctors Wayne Patton and Emily Eddy. How are y'all today?
It's Friday. We made it.
It's Friday the 13th, Wayne.
Oh, we may not make it.
So far, we're all right.
Yeah.
We've now dated the podcast. Nobody can listen to this outside of that context.
It's okay.
All right. Anyway, so we're back doing a leadership series. Emily Eddy has spent some time doing some research, extensive research in the area of leadership, written a fantastic white paper that's available on the Magellan website at thinkmagellan.com. And I think Adam will maybe post a link or a copy of that here with the podcast. But Emily, before we jump into kind of the series, why don't you give us an idea of like what went into this research and what we're going to be talking about?
Yeah, so the research really started with us thinking about how we as a company want to train our own leaders. So I just started doing some reading about what would it look like for us to walk onto a campus or connect with some folks online and really try to help them bring about an effective and a good change on their campus. And there's lots of elements to it. And if you start diving into leadership literature, it's like it's a bottomless hole. I mean, there's so much of it. And there's a pretty large swath of it that's basically sets of principles for leadership. And most of those are good. Nothing wrong with that. But then there's some that I found a little more helpful, which dealt more specifically with what leadership looks like in context. And that's, as a company, what we run into very, very often. Every campus is different from every other campus. And the leaders that are the most effective are those that can read the context of their campus. They can read the culture, the way the campus fires, what its values are, and can work in tandem with those to bring about a good change. Now, no campus is simply one thing. They're large and complex beasts often. But just having some working terminology about how different campus cultures might make a space for good leadership became something that was pretty important for us as a company, and we wanted to share it here because we thought it might help out some of the folks that we're working with in a larger sense.
Yeah, kind of to get a lay of the land of the different kind of something we'll talk about in a bit, the cultures of campus, but really we deal with such a vast array of personality types and people, and it's part of the fun of what we do. I think we brag on the fact that we're practical and adaptable, and this is an area where we have to be.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think as each place, one of those things that, could bring real value to any of the projects or even to just leadership on a campus without us being there, is maybe taking some time to reflect on, their campus in light of these, so this kind of lends us to these 5 kind of areas, right, or metaphors for the campus and the way it is structured. As we were talking about beforehand, some of these might just fit right in as you hear them, so, going over them, we're going to talk about the campus metaphors as an ecosystem, as a culture, as a machine, as an institution, and as a marketplace. And probably right off the bat, 1 or 2 of those probably resonates for people. But there's probably some value if you haven't thought about, your organization in one of these other lights. So, my thought was culture and marketplace are probably ways people have looked at their campus quite frequently. But, to think about, ecosystem and what that metaphor looks like. And, it could bring some insights to life, and so as we talk through each of these, I think that's probably the takeaway as we've landed on is some of these, are going to sound familiar, but for the ones that don't, those aren't bad. There could be some valuable insights by, taking that metaphor and laying it over top of your organization and trying to see does something catch your eye that maybe you didn't see before.
Yeah, and this is not by any means a definitive list. These are just the sorts of categories or metaphors that rose to the top as I was reading a lot of things. These are things that showed up over and over and over again. So that's what we seized on for these. But there are others. You may have a different way on your campus to describe things. I find this sort of thing especially helpful when there's a leadership transition because leaders will tend to import metaphors and sets of terminology from other places. So if you find you're having a communication problem with, say, the new CFO, it may be that they understand the campus differently than you do. And the quicker you can parse out what that's about, the quicker you can work together effectively.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right. Well, jumping in then, why don't we start, before we talk about the first metaphor, but why do these metaphors matter? And what are the common, what we already kind of led in with, the 5 we're going to kind of talk about, but why is it such a significant?
Well, all my academic training's in English, so probably not surprising when I say words matter. And words really kind of shape the way we experience the world. So just to take a stupid example, I've got kids. I've got a 13-year-old. I've got a 10-year-old. And my 10-year-old is very analytical. So if I walk upstairs in the morning to get him out of bed and I say, "Hey, Avery, are you feeling sick today?" That's going to position him right away to feel sick. He's going to suddenly start looking for symptoms. If I say instead, "What are you looking forward to today?" that's going to position him differently. So that's, again, it's a very small example, and I think we all have everyday examples that way. But if you're on a campus where the main thing you talk about is money, that's going to tell you something about what's happening. If the main thing you talk about is the student experience, that's going to tell you something. So just having ears to hear will let you know what reality feels like to the people on your campus, whether they're online or whether they're there in person.
Yeah, we've got a few relationships right now where new presidents have come into a campus environment. Maybe they've come into a very stable situation, and maybe they've come into a situation where there's a bit of, let's call it just turmoil on campus, or they're in a transition, higher ed in the position it's in right now. So there are a lot of variables that are going on. But if you have a president that's been brought in, say, by a board who is a brilliant person in terms of marketing the institution and they're a bit of a finance whiz, well, that's a great thing to have. But if he's not a background, say, in education, and he comes into a campus of, say, 1,000 faculty that have spent their life in that type of verbiage, to your point, where we're talking about learning and education and students, and this very, say, excited new leader comes in and he's talking about the exciting things that we can do to drive revenue and ROI, there's a lesson to be learned there for that leader, right? You've got to be adaptive to his new, what we'll talk about, the culture, the environment, but how they see that, if they're radically different, that can create some tension for the leader, and various leaders, and the rank and file staff and faculty. And
that could really help with transition. So maybe that's part of why somebody's been brought in, because maybe things aren't going well somewhere. And so we're bringing someone in, but it's like we see it a lot. It's a small business, a school, whatever it is, having some grids to sort of say, okay, let me analyze what's going on here. How are they seeing themselves? Yeah. So right now, I see these people are acting like, they're in an ecosystem. But what I think is going to help us get out is we shift some focus more towards the culture or marketplace elements. And so knowing where folks are and how they see things, what their primary grid is going to help you transition them to another way of thinking as well. So lots of good reasons.
It's basically teaching, right?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
At Magellan Learning Solutions, our mission is to help our clients' educational missions with tailored curricular and operational solutions to help them thrive. To meet the accompanying challenges, the experts at Magellan Learning Solutions offer a full spectrum of services in the areas of curriculum development, operational administration, training and professional development, enrollment and marketing, or custom solutions to niche projects. Whether managing turnkey projects, consulting, or acting as a force multiplier, Our experience and relational approach will help your team attain its goals. For all your educational needs, think Magellan. Visit us at thinkmagellan.com today and set up an introductory meeting.
Let's jump in and talk about the first one. I think the first one we wanted to talk about is the ecosystem. And so the question is, what is kind of at stake? What's important to think about when we overlay the grid of an ecosystem onto our educational structure?
Yeah. I don't think this is probably the first metaphor that comes to mind for a lot of people. Here at Magellan, we talk about this a lot, though, and we talk about it in terms of the way that campus systems relate to each other. So, for example, if your admissions application isn't working very well and it's not asking for the right information, then that's not going to feed the right information into your student information system, and everything's going to be messed up for the next number of years as that student's there. So that's an example of an ecosystem going poorly. If you read the Chronicle or Inside Higher Ed, you've probably seen discussions recently on a somewhat higher level about this sort of thing happening, where I think we all know there's an enrollment cliff that's starting to happen and getting worse. So you have states where, for example, the population's going down and there's an enrollment cliff, like everywhere in the Northeast, in the U.S., for instance. Asking really, really hard questions like, how do we keep all these regional publics open? There just aren't going to be enough students. So you have presidents, you have provosts, you have legislators having conversations with each other about, for example, should the state get involved in approving which majors are happening at which campuses so that they can control the flow of students? Should the state say this campus isn't allowed to enroll more than this many students? Or should some campuses be allowed to die? And that's what happens in an ecosystem discussion, right? It's all about how the resources get distributed, how information flows, how people move, how checks and balances happen. It's about how the whole functions. And there's different wholes, right? There's the individual campus, or then there's campus systems. So that's an example of where we're seeing that, a lot of that right now.
We've often talked about ecosystem, from a productive standpoint going in. We've said, what does the ecosystem look like? And we kind of often think about the ideal ecosystem, right? And how we create one that, you jump somebody to the front of the line, instead of that long-term, evolution.
Shameless plug. We did a whole podcast over ecosystems. So tune into that.
So what can a leader, within a higher ed ecosystem do with this?
There's probably a couple of things, and I know you all have probably more examples from working with clients than I do on this. But one is to be very, very aware that if you're in a campus that thinks in terms of its own whole, right, how everything works together, what you need to do is define boundaries, manage territory, and make sure resources move in an equitable fashion. You probably don't need to come in and do a lot of, for example, zero-based budgeting, things like that. It's more about managing the flow that's already happening. So there's that kind of thing. The other thing is to be aware that when you're in a high teamwork situation, you're also going to be in a high conflict situation. So that's if you want to go Darwinian, you can go Darwinian here, right? There's a little bit of a battle sometimes that's going to happen on campuses that work like ecosystems, because there's an awareness that resources are scarce and that we've got to fight for them. So that's a situation that a leader in an ecosystem needs to learn to manage in a fair way, and in a way that's good for the whole, rather than stoking.
Yeah, not necessarily clients that we've had, even though there's examples of this. We talk to a lot of university leaders that are just peers and friends and whatnot, and it is this notion of the transitional leader who's needed to come into a situation that we've talked about. There could be enrollment issues or physical plan issues, or all the range of things that a kind of executive level team at a university deals with. And they may be, like we've talked about, they may be a finance person or it gets the money, or they could be a very eloquent, visionary leader, but they've got to understand at the same time, and the self-aware ones do, that there is this tension and conflict, that I'm coming in to this particular situation. And we were at a campus recently where we talked to a lot of faculty and leaders, and remember there was this notion of every single person on that campus, whatever their position or leadership level, they have a notion of what they perceive to be the golden age of that institution, right? Yeah. And so if you have 1,000 people on campus, you have 1,000 different opinions of where maybe they have been, where they are currently, and where they need to go. And leaders at different levels, they kind of need to be cognizant of the fact that that is a real dynamic. So you're not dealing with, 50% of the faculty and staff feel this specific way on a given issue. Maybe you can cluster them that way, but there's probably 1,000 different things that they're coming in dealing with. So talk about the need to not only have a certain skill set in that setting, but to be super reflective and contemplative about, okay, how do I navigate in this new space? If it's a new leader, or if it's a current leader and things change, they have a situation come up and it's a big pivot, and maybe initiatives that the school wants to take on, or maybe there's a big downturn in enrollment that they weren't anticipating. But to be adaptive, strategic, flexible, those are all skill sets we'll probably talk about in this series of higher ed leadership podcast.
Yeah, and something that really struck me when I was kind of looking through this section of the white paper was just kind of the context, because there's this element where you describe kind of education, higher ed, as an ecosystem. Mm-hmm. But that kind of freaked me out a little bit, because I'm like, ooh, if you're just a leader at this little school, mm-hmm. Or halfway down the line at some little school, like thinking about the entirety of higher ed as that ecosystem, right? And especially from that Darwinian perspective mm-hmm. of like, oh, good grief. But then it's a little more empowering to me to think about like, oh, my entity, my organization mm-hmm. makes it a little more manageable, especially the higher up in that chain you are, because you have the power to maybe tip the scales, so if the ecosystem looks like it's getting out of balance, you have some power and control. So I'm even just thinking from, an ecosystem perspective is something to acknowledge that and provide opportunities maybe for people in parts of the ecosystem that see something going out of balance. So you might not from where you are. It just looks like it's all flowing, but having a system where people can point out, hey, this part of the ecosystem is dying. And maybe in leadership, we have to make those decisions of, well, I think that part should maybe be dying or maybe not. Yeah. Oh, wow. What is impact? Oh, somebody's thrown something that's not native mm-hmm. in there, and it's harming that part of the ecosystem. How do I, rectify that and make it healthy again?
Somebody brought kudzu.
Yeah, kudzu.
You're in Virginia. That's an issue. Yeah, I mean, just one sort of small example of this. I used to work in a unit that had admissions and financial aid and registrar, and it's a common enough structure. And the person who oversaw this was very good at understanding how systems work together. So she was willing, I think, to really do the hard work to make sure things flowed well, that resources were equitably distributed, and so on. The campus as a whole, though, was fairly turfy. And it was very, very difficult to get flow to happen because people had so much their own idea of what their turf was and how they wanted to manage their resources, rather than thinking of them as our resources. Now, I think progress was made over time, but when you are an ecosystemic leader on a campus that really doesn't work that way, it's going to be a long and a hard slog.
Wow, so that's really powerful mm-hmm. alone, right? So if you've got those people that are trying to establish their own brand and their their focus is on trying to climb kind of the ladder or the hierarchy, are they thinking of our shared mission? Right. And that's more important than just what I'm accomplishing.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not even ambition. I think sometimes it's just, if I've been, and I'm making up this example, this isn't about anyone. If I've been a financial aid processor for 17 years and I have done it this way for 17 years and it works really well and I know everything about it, if you bring in something new and ask me to do it some new way, that's going to be hard.
Right.
Not even because I'm being obstructionist or because I don't think you're right. It's just that I am what I am and I've been that way for a long time. So I don't think we want to underestimate those things.
Yeah, well, that's I guess that's the next thing. It can, maybe it doesn't provide all the answers, but it can find those issues that need to be, discussed and addressed.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I like to think in terms of ecosystems. So if somebody says to me, I can eliminate 80% of what you have to do for your job and that'll free you up to do something new and creative, I'm all for it. Not everybody wants that. Many people really enjoy being very expert at what they're doing, knowing what their job's going to look like every day. So that's a threat to the ecosystem when somebody won't adapt, right? And that's another principle of an ecosystem. It has to adapt.
Right. Wow. So I guess having a good leader that can kind of help create the buy-in to that model, important to show folks the value of how, having that shared mission and vision, the shared approach can benefit the unity of the organization. And then ideally, I guess everybody's a little self-interested, right? So probably how that then benefits the individual.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I mean, this is a great discussion. I mean, I think, again, if you'd like to hear more about the concept of ecosystem, we do have a podcast where we just discussed that in a broader sense. So go give that a listen. With that, we appreciate everybody tuning in for this first of 5 in our leadership series. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to our conversation on the many ways we talk about higher education. If you enjoyed the podcast today or found it helpful, follow us on iTunes, Spotify, or where you listen to podcasts, and listen to our other episodes. Leave a review to let us know what you think. If you or your school is looking for help with RSI, your online ecosystem, curriculum, or course development, think Magellan. Our team would love to help. Reach out to us at thinkmagellan.com. Thank you for joining us on the Magellan Podcast, Navigating Education in the 21st Century.